To the Amplified Healing Podcast. This is a musician health advocacy podcast with Lisa Joy Glassman and me, Hal Gill. And we're going to talk to Lisa Joy a little bit about her experience and what we're doing here. The mission, by the way, that we've come up with for Amplified Healing is to be the go to resource for musicians' mental and physical well being, providing support, information, and inspiration to enhance overall health and longevity in the music industry. Lisa, over to you. How you been?
Oh, I'm doing really well, Hal. Thank you so much for interviewing me here as the beginning to our podcast journey.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. I know that it's something that's been near and dear to our hearts for a long time. So I'd like to hear more about your journey to where we are today. I think that would be interesting for our listeners as well and to our future guests, who I think will be many. How did you get started in all this? And just from the top, wherever you want to start.
Oh my goodness. From the top. From the top is so hard. Do we start in the womb or do we start in early childhood love of
Well,
music?
to give you some context, I like to start my biography with during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was in utero, which explains a lot. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. Well, during the fat years of the Reagan administration, I also was in utero. And
Mm.
that also explains a lot. As an exennial generation, I've been carving my own path with my father's example of having his own business, with the love of music given to me by both of my parents, literally. I came out of the womb knowing lyrics to songs somehow from those early days. It all seeps in. I think about Paul Simon's song Late in the Evening seeping through. And I think about that, the music seeping through, the vibrations of music coming through our individual beings and through our collective experience and healing us, right? And affecting us. And so creating ways and pathways of greater healing and to promote and to help make the making and creation and performing of music more sustainable means that we can all experience greater healing. So that's the top. And I think that gets us to here at Amplified Healing right now, where we can share conversations around the inherent and innate healing power of music and to talk about the challenges that musicians face as creators, that they face as performers, that they face as people who live inside moving vehicles, going on tour from place to place, and to really come up with practical solutions and to share those practical solutions with those who are on this path, on this road of creating and sharing.
Well, that is spot on what I was thinking about as well. The huge costs it takes to get oneself out on stage and to perform for an audience. So much has to go in before a musician is ready for that. And the challenges it takes to put oneself out there are tremendous. I think that one of the things on our radar has been the current landscape and the high rates of mental and physical health issues among musicians. I expect you've experienced some of those on your own in your career. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, the kinds of challenges that you've run into, some of the physical ailments you might have encountered yourself, and how you dealt with them.
Absolutely. I can think back to playing the flute, which was my original instrument beyond the voice. And I can remember in high school, like my fingers going a little bit numb, especially on this left hand coming across the body and trying to troubleshoot that with position. Like maybe you don't have to have perfect horizontal height, maybe like a marching band, like could you tilt down and what would that do? And I remember
Hmm.
I was also an athlete, so I was always thinking about the body and how it moves and how to increase its efficiency, to increase its endurance and power to function. I was thinking of that, of course, in terms of volleyball and in terms of running. Those were my high school sports. And then I also was a bowler. So bowling,
Wow.
which is very physical, is also very mental because you're really just trying to do the same thing over and over again, right? You're trying to get the ball to swing in the same way. You're trying to take the same 4 or 5 steps. You're trying to hit the same mark out there on the lane, and ideally if you do all those things then you get the same result, which would be a strike. But most of the time you don't hit the thing perfectly and you don't get the strike. And what is that? That's mental, right? That's just all about mental. So there's this overlay between sort of athletics and games and music that all comes together. And the repetitive motion of each of those things is really where I find the physical ailments come in. So, like I said, I've had my own experience with numbness and tingling, even dating sort of early back into my youth. And then now that I've seen that sort of reaction in the body from many of the players that I've worked with, and all instruments, whether it's saxophones, guitars, mandolins, banjos, drums, repetitive motion injuries definitely come to the top of the list. There are specific things that happen a lot to certain instrumental players, but overall, societal experience of driving cars and using cell phones and using computers, that's where I see a lot of the challenges and issues come in on a physical level.
Well, that's a fact. And the physical level then can impact the other levels. I remember, I think Keith Emerson was reaching a point with some issues with his playing that he couldn't do it anymore and took his own life. As a result, I think of that, at least that was what the press was saying at the time, as I recall, that a lot of it was his depression surrounding his degradation of his ability to perform. And that it's something that happens to all of us in time. I'm experiencing some things I can't do that I used to be able to do. So, one of the things, too, that we wanted to talk about, aside from the physical ailments, was the fact that we think we're filling a niche here with the accessible, tailored resources available to the musicians. Can you talk a little bit more about what you plan to be doing with our guests here?
One of just people in the music community taking their lives. That is definitely something that we're going to talk about. It's just overall mental health and pressure to be a performer. And, what happens in your life when you've become so specialized that you can only see one pathway for existence, which I think is maybe what you just alluded to there, which is,
Yeah.
being really depressed about your physical body failing you, and that's twofold. So, one, we seek to engage and educate our population, our communities about ways in which they can increase the longevity of their ability to play. So, looking at, of course, specific troubleshooting of individual uh, injuries is one thing, but looking at overall types of movements, breath work, meditative techniques that you can engage in order to increase the longevity of your ability to move your body, to move it in the ways that you want to move it so that you can play instruments, you can sing. And then also looking at similar techniques for just overall longevity and for dealing with life. There are things that are out of our control. And we know this because we can't affect the actions of others. We can't make anyone do anything that, they don't want to do or that they don't mean to do, or it might even just be an accident, right? Accidents do happen and they can be life changing. And so, you know, really educating people around ways in which we can weather the storm and weather the events that life showers upon us, I'll say, and how to manage that can be a lot simpler and more powerful than we realize that it can be, and it can be done in the environments in which we find ourselves. So we're definitely going to focus on what it is like to be on the road, to be traveling, to be living in a moving vehicle, to be sleeping in different beds or non beds, to be performing at hours which are, in opposition to our natural biorhythms. So performing at night, performing late at night, getting hired for gigs where you're the opening act and you're also the late night campfire jam leaders, which often happens at the beginning of people's musical careers and festival careers, and how to navigate through that with Phil Fettuccini. If you guys are listening, you might know about him. He's a longtime deadhead, and he made these great stickers that said, "We train for this shit." And they're usually in blue and yellow. You might see them out and about in venues. And yeah, we train for this shit, except for when we don't train for it, then we might not be able to do it for as long or as well as we want. So, looking at the training aspects as well.
Well, right, and we don't get good at anything if we don't practice it, and practicing together,
Oh,
I think, is really an important part of this. So, one of the things I foresee that we'll be doing, and you've already started doing, and maybe you'll like to talk a little bit about this, is the creation of a supportive community where just being a guest on the podcast doesn't just afford you merely that, though it could be only that, but you can also join in this bigger supportive community of people who are conscious of how isolating and competitive our industry can be, but at the same time, how much we can help each other. And what we've seen, I think, collectively, and maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about this, is how that community has come together for you from the time you started out with a focus on musicians' health to the present day. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about your journey in that formation of that community and where that community is going and how you foresee it growing.
ah, absolutely. I mean, I think that community building and community resourcing is really, I mean, it's always really where we can thrive the most. It's always where we can really gather the most help. Right now we're facing quite the landscape in this country, in America, and worldwide, where things feel a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. In it places where we have a network, right? But a safety net to be held. And for me, the music of the Grateful Dead and the community that surrounds it has really been my always go to, my constant, my anchor place. I can always go home to the music of the Grateful Dead. And I experienced that, I think, by having traveled to really realize that, to travel to different cities and to go to a weekday live music show somewhere. Often it's okay, I'll go to this Dead cover, but let's check it out. The songs themselves provide a home, right? The community of music is uniquely special in that the songs themselves, the vibrations of the music itself, provides healing. And we all gather for that purpose. And we are very grateful to the people who play it. And we're also grateful to the people who provide a space to share it. And then we're grateful for one another for showing up to be there. And it was in the Grateful Dead community in Washington, D.C., the greater Washington area, that I really dove back into music, and then decided to take my efforts and energy as a personal trainer and as a massage therapist, as a yoga instructor, to bring my skills into this community and to hone them there over this past decade. So I did a first a life adult decade, really being hardcore in the fitness and wellness industry in that set of communities, and then taking those skills and now bringing them into the music community.
Well, that is exactly what is wonderful, I think, about your niche, that it is focused on that musician community. I think this organization that, or this podcast that we're putting together is going to do a good job of combining personal stories and your expert advice and practical techniques that will demonstrate maybe you want to talk a little bit about which techniques you're thinking are going to be most available. And it's going to depend on the guest, really, and what their issues are, obviously. But tell me a little bit about what kind of techniques you could possibly show me, maybe right now, that might be helpful
Yeah.
to for certain issues.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that this podcast is seeking to do is to provide technical support inside the podcast. And you're right, it will be based on who is here as our guest, what challenges they face. Maybe they have techniques that they're going to share with our audience and listeners as well, and with us. And they might present a challenge that we can address in the moment. So I have to be honest, I'd love to ask you, Hal, a little bit about what's going on with you so that I could pick the best
Oh,
technique to be helpful in this moment right now.
oh gosh, as far as my playing goes, one thing I'm noticing is I don't do it often enough. And like you were talking about flute playing, right? My next here is a fife. Pull one of my peelers off. This is a very pretty little acrylic fife that Ron Peeler makes up in New England. He's not doing a lot more of these, kind of not using it a lot. But in holding it, we want to hold our elbow up and out, and we want to hold the shoulder as well. So what I end up with is pain through the arm and shoulder after marching for a certain length of time with the fife up and out, like you see here. So, what have you got for my shoulder here that's going to make me want to droop that arm or drop this elbow?
Mm. So I'm curious, I want to ask you two questions, which is,
Okay.
does the pain happen while you're playing, or is
Yes,
it?
if I'm playing for a while and I'm up at attention holding this that way, by the time I get to about the 20th tune or so, I'm beginning to really feel it in the arms because I'm not used to holding this pose.
Mm.
I only do it like three
And then,
times a year.
right. And then does it last? Does it go away when you stop, or does it
Goes away
linger?
when I stop, pretty much. It's just weakness from not having the strength to keep doing that as long as I used to.
Yeah. So I think that that is a great analysis for yourself, that there's weakness there and that the pain comes from lack of endurance-based strength, right? There's strength that we talk about with is like the amount of load that you can pick up once, right? Like sort of sometimes we call this a max strength. And then there's endurance-based strength, which is how long you can put that muscle under that endurance. So I think you hit the nail on the head initially, which is that you don't do it that much. And
Right.
so, yes, and I think we mentioned about practice. So I think that's one thing. I think an exercise that you could potentially engage in would be a form of a rowing exercise, which maybe we'll make right here. But essentially, you could use a band if you want it to be upright in the upright position. So you're doing the same thing as you're doing when you're playing the flute. You have your arms up. You could do it with both arms or with one arm, and then you're squeezing back. But instead of letting the elbows droop, pull them right to where they go. Yeah. So that's
Okay.
one. You could do this bent over. I think we'll show two variants of this. So if you know about a bent over row, obviously we can do rows with all different arm variants. I'm specifically showing
Okay.
you this one that would
Right.
tap at that back rear delt.
Really getting at it. I can feel that.
You can feel it. And then
Yep.
the second thing I would look at, and we can do this a little bit now as well, is just the neck. Yeah, exactly. So when you're playing the flute, um, thinking about your airway and where your head is placed over your torso and how that allows you the space to breathe. We all have a tendency to pitch our heads forward, again, sort of from environmental context of cell phone, computer, reading, that sort of thing. But I'm curious to note when you have the flute up or the fife up with you, where your head is in space, because training that rowing motion and that holding motion
Mhm.
training it where your head actually sits or where you ideally want your head to sit can be part of the conversation. So I'd love to show you a chin tuck, which it looks like you've had some experience doing before. Exactly. So I would start with a plain chin tuck with you sitting up right here and then pulling your chin back, holding, breathing, and relaxing. And then again, pulling the chin back, keeping the shoulders at the height where you'd actually want them for playing, breathing, and releasing. So we definitely have chin tucks in there. But for you, what I would then do is take the fife, take your fife. Yes. Bring it up to that level. And what I would think about doing is stretching it forward, pulling that row back,
Mhm.
setting your head where you want it, and breathing there. So pull it back, hold. Yes. So playing with that, one of the things I like about this is obviously you have a fife, which is a nice small instrument, but you could imagine perhaps if you were on your marching band's tour bus, uh, holding your fife or holding a similar instrument and practicing these movements and practicing these breath work movements with it, which we didn't get too deep into just now. But yeah, tell me a little bit about how you feel.
Well, that breathwork thing is really important to get the kind of phrasing and ability to play through a phrase without having to grab breath at inconvenient spots. So that when playing together, if a band of fifers has its phrasing accurate, it's pretty impressive because you can see each one of them grabbing a little air right at the moment. I haven't learned one thing, one technique I'd like to learn, and if it's possible to learn, I think it might just be a talent, is circular breathing. Were you able to do that as a
Mm.
flute player?
No, I haven't been able to master the circular breathing. I have taken a couple of rounds of trying it. I have definitely done it. I found myself in it where I'm like, okay, I think it was just happening, but I haven't spent a lot
You
of
can't
time.
click, right?
Yeah, I
Consciously.
haven't I haven't I haven't practiced super a lot to do it.
I
It
never
can
did
obviously
either,
be very
really, but when I found out that it was possible, I was kind of overawed by the talent of some of my colleagues. Make me feel very second rate sometimes. But the main point of fifing is just making noise, right? And getting that noise to be communicated across the sound of anything. A fife will penetrate. That's why I don't play a lot or practice a lot because I live in a condo in Washington, D.C. My neighbors would have some objection, I think, eventually. Uh, so that's me and my music. But let's get back to you a little more. And one of the things I think we want to go over, and I'll take the microphone for this a little bit, is what our content strategy is, what our episode format is going to be like. We'll have these interviews with these guest musicians. We're going to have expert interviews, in that aspect from they know their bodies and music better than anybody else. So they'll have most of the talking time, I'm hoping. And then we could expand this out. We don't know exactly which direction it's going to go into entirely, but Q&A sessions with listeners was actually one thing we talked about. How do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, I think that, just to kind of go through the ideas, we want to really focus our conversation around the healing power of music and around practical solutions that musicians face, practical solutions to challenges that musicians face so that we can continue forth amplifying the healing power of music, that we can get a greater penetration of positive vibration across the ether so that we can all benefit. We are being affected by all of the vibrations all of the time, and this is an opportunity to be intentional about what we send out. And so, my experience with working with individuals and working on site at different venues, working on site at festivals with musicians and with audience members as well, has has really provided these amazing, insightful conversations, like watching light bulbs click and feeling them go off in my own consciousness, watching people have the realization about what power they do have, what abilities they do have, and how they can affect themselves and others more positively have been incredibly beautiful. And I want to feature those conversations because those conversations are magical and they can really help move us forward. They know that they've moved me forward, and I've seen them move the musicians that I've worked with forward to have a greater experience and a greater control over their own actions, and to have longer lasting abilities to keep going forward, to keep moving forward, and to keep producing and making music. And by producing, I mean performing, creating, writing, actually, the production, all of it. And
Right.
so that's the main thing, is it's going to focus on the conversation, but in those conversations we're also going to include those discussions about challenges and how to overcome them and what are some simple techniques. So that is another segment of our podcast, is going to be providing the techniques and giving our listeners an opportunity to practice them right there on the spot. And then obviously we're doing this audio video. So you'll also have the opportunity, if you decide to listen to the podcast, to watch the video of the podcast, but we're going to segment out the technique part as well. So you'll be able to go onto the Active Potential app and do just the technique of the week, or just the exercise or the meditation that we went over or went through in the podcast, or perhaps a whole series, depending on what the issues are and what the musician wants to share. And then we want to have an inclusive space. So this is definitely a variety show, a little bit, in that it's a multi-segment podcast. We're going to be doing interviews with a number of musicians, and we're going to offer the opportunity for some people to listen to some of these interviews live, because no promises that every live interview is going to make it into our recorded podcast, or that every piece of it will. And we have, some unique opportunities for listeners, people who are patrons of our various musicians. I know we'll have an opportunity to get to listen to the live interviews, and supporters of our podcast will also have the opportunity to listen to the live interviews. And we are going to do some segments for listener questions, so you can ask our musical guests questions, and also opportunities for interested listeners, maybe musicians themselves or audience members, to ask us questions, to maybe bring up a topic, a challenge that they're having, an issue with playing, and to be able to come onto the podcast that way. So I could see there's going to be redundancy. Perhaps a number of people will be facing the same issue, and we will want to feature that. We want to feature solutions that are really pertinent to your lives and to include them on the podcast. So, multiple segments, video and audio, great conversations, practical techniques you can take with you. Am I missing anything, Hal?
Oh, I can imagine we can go a lot of places. So I don't know that you're missing anything yet, but we have some theme examples that we just listed out a little bit of, and there's some other things we might actually kick in there that I had not really we haven't dug into too deeply. But one of the big stressors, I'm sure, on most people who are entrepreneurs, as most performing musicians tend to be, is financial wellness and career sustainability in addition. So, taking care of the physical body, our instrument, and being able to perform is one thing, but having the skills and other soft skills out there to negotiate the world, and both in the music industry, and there were some interviews set up for a friend out in a radio station, community radio, KSKQ. And one of them, for example, our friend Reed Mathis, got on there and just blew me away with the amount of information he was able to convey about what he had been doing just since the pandemic. Because when that lockdown happened, a lot of us weren't able to get out on stage anymore. One thing led to another. We'll be talking to, among others, David Gantz pretty soon, who during that time period started daily live streams. He did a nice request for me actually on my birthday a couple of days ago, which was nice. It was a tune called Shut Up and Listen, which I enjoyed very much. He co wrote that, by the way, with Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead that did most of the Jerry lyrics. In any case, yeah, so this is going to be a grand adventure, I think. We've talked about certainly performance anxiety and the stress and mindfulness techniques and relaxation exercises for musicians. I think your Breathing 101 segments really help a lot in that. Injury prevention and recovery, like my new exercises, and rowing. Thank you. And then, of course, we've talked about mental health and addiction a little bit. We'll be probably touching on that because a lot of us do have a journey there in addition to challenges with physical side effects. Nutrition and fitness for musicians, I think that's one I need to work on a lot. And then sleep and stress management. I'm pretty good at sleeping, but I'd probably need to do less of it. We mentioned financial wellness and career sustainability, building and maintaining healthy relationships. Because after all, if a band doesn't get along together or the audience doesn't really pick up what the band is down, the magic doesn't happen. So we're really thinking a lot about that magic that we can convey and paying back into the music community, something that we have benefited from ourselves. So I'm looking forward to that. Do you want to add anything else before we wrap up our little interview here?
I do. Thank you. I would like to just I love that sort of supplied our range of topics, big categories. Definitely going to be talking about financial health and wellness, as well as digital health and wellness, how to navigate the use of our technology as a challenge that a number of musicians face as well, sort of this wanting to bounce and just play music and be in the woods and nature, and having to be an entrepreneur, perhaps when that's not even what you want to be doing. And then, even if it is what you want to be doing, how to navigate that, techniques and skills around that. We have a couple of very successful who can also share their wisdom. So, really looking at that collaboration of conversation between our guests and how we can then hope to inspire our collective actions towards positivity and towards wellness for our whole community. And of course, yes, talking about addiction and mental health and the environment around it and nutrition. These are all interplaying factors, and I can see we're definitely going to get into that on the road. We have at Active Potential, we have a nutrition guide we're working on that actually takes you to like Sheets and Wawa and Loves and looks at the food that might be available to you from 12 to 5 a.m. when you might be getting off of a gig, and then turning that around and what can you eat, how can you do your best with what you have and where you are, and how can you meet people where they're at and then take it from there. So we all come to the table with our unique experience and skill sets, and this is an opportunity for us to come together on this podcast and to jam and to collaborate and to share and to inspire ourselves and to share that inspiration with our whole community. So,
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for being my guest today. And with that, we're going to wrap the recording and we'll see what we've got.